Okay, welcome everybody to this very special session, not only because it deals with the world-renowned Edward Said, but also because our guest speaker, Professor Timothy Brennan, is one of the most outstanding scholars in the field of cultural studies and comparative literature. He was Said's student and close friend. We're all very grateful to Professor Brennan for his generosity in accepting our invitation. I would also like to extend our thanks to Professor Lamia Al-Ani and her sister, Mrs. Nawal Abdullah, manager of the Jordan branch of Inside Arabia magazine, for paving the way to this great event. Since I mentioned Inside Arabia, it's worth mentioning also that Inside Arabia has had a live interview with the Professor Brennan about Edward Said, and this interview will be published soon. Okay, so Edward Said is so well known in all academic and cultural circles of the Arab world and everywhere else in the world that he doesn't really need an introduction on my part. However, relevant to our event today, I would like to mention that according to Professor Brennan, Said infused the humanities with renewed significance. His works like Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism demonstrated the centrality of literature and art to political discourse. Award-winning Professor Timothy Brennan of the University of Minnesota is a prominent scholar in his own right. He works on the relationship between comparative literature, world literature, and global English. He's a member of both the Departments of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature and English, and is a member of the graduate faculty of the Department of American Studies. He's also affiliated with the Institute for Global Studies and the Institute for Advanced Studies. His books, essays, and course offerings deal with issues of intellectual history, cultural theory, the Marxist traditions, the avant-gardes, theories of colonialism and imperialism, problems of translation, and popular music. He is the author of many books and countless essays. To choose only a few of his well-known publications, books in the field of cultural studies like Borrowed Light, Vico, Hegel, and the Colonies, 2014, Wars of Position, The Cultural Politics of Left and Right, 2006, Empire in Different Colors, 2007, At Home in the World, Cosmopolitanism, now, 1997, Salman Rushdie and the Third World, Myths of the Nation. These are only some of his publications. His most recent book, Places of Mind, 2021, is described as an outstanding, I'm quoting, as an outstanding intellectual and personal biography of one of the 20th century's most brilliant and debated scholars. Deeply researched and erudite, Places of Mind is also written with the elegance and power of a novel that Said himself would have admired. Okay, to read these pages is to understand the enormity of Said's often singular contributions and the profound void he has left behind, unquote. Just because our time is so precious, I really cannot go on through all the details of Professor Brennan's amazing, breathtaking CV. It is available online anyway. But one more remark that I would like to mention about the intriguing title of the presentation, Edward Said Making Literature Dangerous, which raised questions in many minds. Allow me, Professor Brennan, to quote only a few words from the email you sent me. Quote, I thought for our session, I would emphasize how literature for Said made him effective politically, how, in other words, his knowledge of literature and language and his public persona as a sensitive reader of imaginative literature trained him as a politician and a partisan of a political cause, unquote. Thank you for listening, and Dr. Brennan, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. That was a very generous introduction. And I want to thank you, Muna, and also Lamia and Nawal. You're the reason I'm here, and I didn't know about your organization before this. And it's lovely to know that there is an organization like this, and I'd like to know more about you. So with that, let me begin. I should maybe just reflect a little bit on what it was like to set out to write a biography like this, because when I did, at the outset, I thought incorrectly, as it turns out, that Edward's story might be forgotten today, that people would have failed to realize that apart from being a presence in the university who changed college curricula and faculty demographics, and a famous public media intellectual, that Edward was also improbably a major political player. He was courted by the Carter administration. He was tapped by Secretary of State George Shultz in the Reagan years. He was asked to fact check US government Middle East white papers by congressional committees. He was named as the chief negotiator of the Palestinian conflict by Anwar Sadat, and considered the go-to interlocutor of the Middle East conflict by the FBI. And he worked as a longtime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he was a major media presence who debated on national television the likes of Ariel Sharon, Jeane Kirkpatrick, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was certainly the most recognizable Palestinian intellectual of the 20th century, or any century, and one of the most revered Arab and American intellectuals of the post-war period, one who achieved crossover fame and institutional authority on a global scale. It seems fitting that the story of his life arrives at just the time that the United States officially recognizes multi-faith Jerusalem as Israel's capital and embraces the outright annexation of all Palestinian land. It could not be more symbolically fraught a time to revisit the life of someone who single-handedly changed the conversation over Israel and Palestine in the United States and Britain. What's often missed about Edward is that he did not just have a message, nor was he simply a standout personality, nor did he only leave behind a series of quotable essays and books with an enviable reception history. It was not just a list of accomplishments or an array of slogans summoned after the fact in a useful shorthand. Beyond all this, he created, and to a large extent was, in ensemble, an object of beauty, something that transcends itself, at once inevitable and effortless, as though it had always existed. I know this sounds a little over the top, like the words of an acolyte, but I think that that's what the record in fact shows, which is not to say that he was not also a pain, quick to anger, vulnerable to flattery, vain, mercurial. But he was astoundingly gregarious, constantly traveling to foreign cities, meeting friends for lunch, making films, speaking to crowds, haranguing friends on the telephone. So that for those of us who knew him, his character or personality was as much his message as anything found in his writing. I say this then as a biographer rather than a former student, and on the basis of research rather than mere opinion. Edward managed to ride a wave of his own creation, always doing in the moment what he at the same time had earlier planned, and currently managed from a hovering place above and outside that moment, as though fate and providence neatly met one another at the site of his words and actions. I think this role of mythical messenger surprised him as much as it did us, and that it was even a burden to him. I know I'm not alone in feeling that he was, as Mohammed Shaheen put it, a great and beautiful novel. Those around him knew this. They even winked and nodded at one another to express that they understood this about him. If this X factor was not really evident in his early schooling and childhood, it became obvious in his 20s as he began to face the public. And in fact, it came about under the pressures of going public, when his conversational brilliance, and his genius was always essentially conversational, wrapped him in an aura that was a little like a Christian conversion story. He would have hated that analogy given his insistence on secularity, but all those Bible study classes he grew up taking at school, not unlike his love for the Catholic communist martyrdom of Antonio Gramsci, made him recognize the affiliations between his own inspiriting transformation in college and grad school and that of the political saints he had already enshrined in childhood. Above all, the Egyptian communist doctor and martyr Farid Haddad, and his own Aunt Nabia, doing charitable work in Cairo for the first Palestinian arrivals into Egypt after the Israeli terror of 1948. Edward had always been magnetically attracted to the militants of the Palestinian cause. He was very animated around them and at home. Just as his life models were radicals whose profile he never lived up to, revolutionary martyrs that I think he admired because he himself could not measure up to their selflessness and sacrifice. By saying this, I'm talking about a conscious plan and a disciplined apprenticeship, both rhetorical and performative. When I say that he made literature dangerous, or that it was in literature and through literature that he polished and perfected his political craft, I'm saying that this was a conscious plan. And he set about to apprentice himself in certain literary figures that would teach him how to conduct himself in public. What I discovered while writing the biography, and this surprised me, is that even Edward's undergraduate and graduate essays are fascinated by the connection between literature and politics. By dwelling on figures from the past like Plato, Dante, and Milton, who were unashamed in their didacticism. They were very much against the modernist grain of Edward's colleagues at the time. He was drawn to their plain speaking, their agitational tradition of letters, the forgotten dimension of canonical writers who were, when you looked at them closely, completely unmodernist. They were rabble-rousers. They were dedicated to clarity and persuasion rather than the opacities of literary form, as one finds in modernist poetry, which was all the rage at the time that Edward was studying. So the seeds of what he later became are very early. Obviously, too, the people he wishes to write about at the dawn of his career, Jonathan Swift, for example, but also the medieval historian and theorist of the civic role of letters, Ibn Khaldun, were literary figures of a different type who themselves held government posts as advisors at court and diplomats, a connection that both excited him and that he emulated. Ibn Khaldun's 14th century masterpiece, the Muqaddimah, explored the parallels between forms of political rule and cultural forms of expression. And he considered writing one of the central crafts in the division of labor. Edward often compared Ibn Khaldun to the 18th century grammarian and historical sociologist Giambattista Vico, probably the greatest influence on Edward's work overall. For Vico, in his New Science, laid out a prehistory of human civilization by observing that early human beings spoke entirely in poetic characters and that the first laws were poems. Added to this, to take another example, just as his political leanings were evident already in his college essays, so too is it striking how early on in his life he became a conscious Arab, a Palestinian partisan, and a political intervener. It happened much earlier than people suspect. The usual story is that it was only after the Nakba that he changed from being a standard issue New York intellectual and English department aesthete, who by the accident of his ethnicity was pushed into activism by the Six-Day War. This turns out not to be true, and he was in fact writing political essays for the Princeton Daily in the mid-1950s. Perhaps the most direct example of his conscious political training in literature, though, can be seen in his most famous book. One of the neglected undercurrents of Orientalism is his apprenticeship under the great philologists that he explores in that book, the Orientalists referred to in the title. He supposedly is castigating them, but in fact, he's trying to learn from them. These Orientalists, we must remember, are literary scholars. He's in awe of their erudition, their familiarity with languages, their sustained, minute studies of obscure texts, and yet at the same time, their ability to turn this specialist knowledge into a grand drama of the human spirit. There's no question that he treated their example as an object lesson to follow. He closely studied their images, rhythms, and motifs, and their ingeniously obvious motifs, in order to account for how they, as humanists, created a kind of authority that reinforced prejudices already in circulation. He wants to learn their techniques for the other side, as it were. One of the more unforeseen aspects of his apprenticeship is the recognition that one derives public power by being perceived as unthreatening. What could be more unthreatening than a literary critic in an age that worships economics, sports, and technology? Being a person who's both widely read and curious about what they do not know. There is, or at least was in many societies, certainly Europe in the early 20th century, in West Bengal today and elsewhere, a particular authority that's granted to those without direct access to power, with no financial stakes in outcomes, a learned, general, nonpartisan observer, if you will. This role he felt could be played best by the literary humanist intellectual. The rhetorical adeptness of those who study literature for a living allows one to recognize the mischief that takes place in the act of representing others in words or images. A great deal of the meaning that one intends gets lost or added in that transfer from idea to thing in language. A literary scholar is alive to these problems, and so can forge a language that can be effective in the political sphere. In Edward's case, among other things, he did this by launching vague coinages like affiliation or the dynastic or Orientalism itself, which then carry this immense symbolic weight. And also, what one learns is the skillful art of evasion, the fashioning of a syntax that accuses while dodging, and that by this tact or evasion, sidestepping unwanted encounters while making one's point. One of his most emphatic political messages is that every people has the right to tell their own story, not have it be told for them by others, what he called permission to narrate. The university, he insisted, is a utopian space and should not be a place for training people to be useful, except insofar as critically imagining a world that is not, that is, better than what is ultimately useful to a society that needs to hear the bad news that their society is not perfect. Think of this particular array of literary talents and orientations then as they shed light on his major accomplishments. What were these accomplishments? He obviously changed the conversation on Palestine by humanist appeal, by the force of his charm, and the full weight of his public image as an urbane, worldly, fiercely intelligent intellectual, a master of that most unthreatening body of knowledge that is English literature. But also as a skilled debater, a scrappy fighter, a quick on his feet interlocutor in the media, where humor was one of the unforeseen weapons in his arsenal, and also a kind of ingenuousness and earnestness that was to many refreshing in a postmodern age. But then finally, and not least important, his indefatigable amassing of sheer data, the informational pedagogical thrust of his books and essays, beginning with the explosive 1979 book, The Question of Palestine, that patiently, fairly, and calmly lays out a devastating case that only the tendentious could deny. This must be seen as the reason why so many attacked him so hysterically, because he presented an airtight case and did it better than any of the talking heads on the other side. In the same way that he was the bane of the postmodern in his insistence on facts, or in the ingenuousness and sincerity which was the secret weapon in his arsenal, so too was his insistence on a mode of knowledge that is exactly the opposite of the one heralded by our digital age. I quote him, quote, "It isn't knowledge as a product or commodity that we need, nor is it a matter of remedying the situation by having bigger libraries, a greater number of terminals, computers, etc., but a qualitatively different knowledge based on understanding rather than on authority, uncritical repetition or mechanical reproduction. It is not facts, but how facts are connected to other facts, how they are constructed, whether they relate to a hypothesis or a theory, how one is to judge the relationship between truth and interest, and how to understand reality as history. This sentiment, end quote, this sentiment, so contrary to the trends of the Reagan-Thatcher era in the United States and British academies, is taken directly from the playbook of those philologists that he called Orientalists. America to him was vexed, he often said, by geography, the dispersion. There's no center. Even where there is a sense of locality, there isn't a sense of commonality. The usurpation of the public space, of the common space, by the media and the corporations is really very disheartening, he said. It's along the lines of such an outlook that his greatest achievements lie, which did not, despite his efforts, take place in the Palestinian arena. His biggest contribution was to bring the humanities centrally into the public discussion and make them central to policy debates and political disputes. He made the humanities dangerous. He persuasively showed that literary concepts like narrative, the image, and representation had political consequences. And he persuaded the public that culture, not just economics, was a key element in political power. He did more both with his personal example, but just as much with his essays, spelling the project out, especially in the Arab world, to revive the image of the intellectual as a creator of agendas, a guardian of the historical record, and a theoretician of the possible. Here is a typical analysis of this type, and again, I'm quoting Edward, quote, "In an age with proliferating informational resources and control, the management and manipulation of these resources usually results in misrepresentation, distortion, or effacement of the human or inhuman agency and interest at work. There exists, therefore, a need for providing counter-information, information that runs counter to and is often hidden by the prevailing consensus. Information whose description and analysis is based on the privilege of human agency and responsible choice. Thus, the intellectual fulfills an archival function, and to do so must, in Foucault's fine phrase, exercise a relentless erudition," end quote. But here I have to make a distinction, for it is really not so much literature that was his teacher, although it was that too, as the criticism of literature, the reading of, the unpacking of, and the deployment of literature as a critic. No one, including many of his close friends and family, suspected that Edward wrote fiction, that he started 2 novels at different stages of his life, that he submitted a first-rate short story to the New Yorker, and that he published poetry. In fact, with close friends, he would often be asked why he didn't write fiction, and he would always answer deceptively, "What would I write about?" That fiction is important not only because of what it reveals about the quality of his mind, the novelistic properties of his criticism, and his award-winning memoir, Out of Place, and the intimacy of his relationship to writing, but because he fought throughout his career against the common prejudice that poets and authors were primary, whereas critics were mere commentators on their work. He resolutely rejected this view, which was one of the reasons he did not, in the end, finish these novels. He spent his life arguing that the greater creative and political and social impact could be found in public intellectuals, not authors of fiction. I think the drama of this conflict between writer and critic, embodied in this complex, highly conflicted personality, is one of the most surprising and uncommented upon aspects of his work. Actually, Edward tried to write 2 novels at different times of his life. The first between college and graduate school, when he spent a year abroad in Cairo working in his father's business. The novel had a huge cast of characters and was built around the goings-on at a girls' school run by a martinet, and featured character studies of resident British officials, American missionaries, political dissidents, and of course, disaffected young intellectuals. The second novel, the one he dropped to write the memoir Out of Place, was a kind of John le Carré political mystery set in Beirut in the 1950s. Both were left unfinished, but they contain some brilliant pages as well as rather thorough outlines for the parts of the novel he never completed. When I wrote that Edward rejected the novel as a literary form, I'm actually quoting him. He said that, but what did he really mean? Obviously, Edward taught novels for a living, and he illustrates many of his political and theoretical points throughout his life by alluding to novels and using them as illustrations of this or that. He lived with the styles and substance of his novels permanently in his brain, and they were part of the very fabric of his personality. So he's not saying something so foolish as that the novel is forever dead as a literary form, or that he no longer wants anything to do with them. What he's saying is that he no longer wishes to express himself by means of straight fiction. We can see this in context. He had always experimented with different kinds of genres on music, autobiography, speculative theories of language, historical vignettes, film criticism, the making of films himself, etc. He tried to mix it up so as not always to be hitting the same key, using humor, nostalgia, opinion, fact-gathering, performance. You could say that he was never more poetic in his prose than in the subjective impressions he left behind in print in the phototext collage about Palestinian everyday life that he did with Jean Moore after The Last Sky. When he decided for the second time not to proceed with writing a novel, he probably recognized that he did not have the time, given his illness, to do that and also write the memoir. He could indulge his fictional talents, in fact, in writing the memoir, thereby squaring the circle. But there was another and more important reason. He wrote throughout his life that it was the intellectual, not the author, who preserved the historical record, who changed the public discussion and imagined possible worlds. The author reflected life. He wanted to change it. And it angered him, I think, that whereas there are hundreds of public forums for novelists in American culture, and all kinds of money and attention lavished on them, that intellectuals are given almost no respect. He took his stand with intellectuals. He looked out over the information landscape of the bewilderingly complex United States and noticed that the intellectual there had lost any resemblance at all with erudition, metaphysical authority, or aesthetic arbitration, as intellectuals in Europe, Latin America, and Asia typically enjoyed. In the United States, they now assumed the guise of anonymous technicians in the sciences or media intellectuals in the quasi-entertainment and news industries. The models were pundits like David Brooks, Paula Zahn, or Christian Amanpour, rather than Benedetto Croce. Edward's model was that of the general intellectual, rather than the professional specialist. He extolled amateurs and loved autodidacticism, which to him was more than the playing down of credentials. It was an improvisatory, unsanctioned knowledge that arose from reading without particular plan or use. The humanities, for most of those who study them, and that includes Edward, trace the life of the spirit. Many of the literary critical schools under which Edward studied at school were quite open about the ways in which literary study in the university could achieve its best self in the form of a secular religion. When directly asked about religion, at least by his American and British readers, Edward would say he was an atheist. His response was much more evasive when speaking to Muslims, however. He campaigned tirelessly on behalf of what he memorably called secular criticism. And yet his life was much more shaped by religion than he let on. And it was not just any religion, but Anglicanism, the religion of the British occupiers in the Cairo of his youth. His upbringing was saturated with Anglican hymns, the daily rituals of Mass, the Book of Common Prayer, for which he maintained an affection even in later life. His use of language, his self-conflicted relationship to English, and his love of and expertise in music could not have been unaffected by a childhood in which this religious musical routine was drummed into his mind. It is astounding that he has nothing to say about any of this in a writing career where autobiography played such a large role. It is an insight into one of the sides of Edward's life that he hid, or at least did not talk about, this side of what he's doing, championing, as he put it, lost causes, angrily dismissing postmodernist cynicism, his emphasis on plain speaking, or his disarmingly ingenuous belief in something better and higher than market capitalism. It's hard to see how these emphases in his work could not have been sustained or been as persuasive as they were without feeling something about what I'm calling this world of spirit. Edward's advocacy for the critic over the artist actually bore fruit very concretely. He lived it. It's simply not generally known, for example, how close Edward had been to two Nobel Prize-winning novelists, Nadine Gordimer and Kensaburo Oe. Gordimer was absolutely in love with Said's intellect and principles, and she wrote him long, revealing, very vulnerable letters, very much like fan letters, over a decade that no one, to my knowledge, has ever written about or commented on. Their relationship was not at all romantic, of course, but it was way beyond cordial or admiring. They had a very special bond. A similar correspondence existed between Said and Oe, and parts of this correspondence were published in a newspaper in Japan, in Japanese, but never, to my knowledge, in English. Both of them at separate times, that is, both Oe and Gordimer, and in different ways, unambiguously wrote that Said's political essays and his general conduct as a speaker and advocate in the public sphere transformed their fiction and made that fiction change, breaking them out of doldrums and opening up new paths of the imagination. I think this is a story that not very many know, and a lot of people would find fascinating, for it shows the primacy of the critical intellectual and the creative author's reliance on that critical sensibility, a point Edward championed, and just the opposite, of course, of what the public normally believes to be the case in this relationship between writer and critic. So there are discrepancies between the life that Said actually led and lived and the way it has been widely narrated. But those discordances were at times of his own making. And as a troubled soul, a person who never felt quite right, as he put it, always at war with himself, never at home, he shows signs of having at times profoundly misunderstood himself. On the one hand, to take a concrete case of this, his memoir, Out of Place, could not be more accurate. The people I interviewed from Edward's childhood were impressed by his prodigious memory and the accuracy with which he remembered the details of his former life. He managed to bring that world alive for them again with indelible portraits of the mannerisms, speech, and names and landscapes of pre-war Cairo, Jerusalem, and Dur el-Shwer. But inevitably, a person's perspective of his own life is fallible. Emotional impasses blur the vision, as they did in this case. The story I tell of his childhood then must be, and was, very different in many respects from the one he tells himself. There's next to nothing about his sisters in the memoir, for instance, or about his explosive and intellectually important first marriage to Myra Janis, about his traumatic head-on car crash with a motorcyclist in Switzerland, about the true nature of his relationship with his music teacher, Ignace Tigerman, in Cairo, and other matters. He hides the number and intensity of his political commitments in his childhood, especially at Princeton and Mount Hermon, and gives us a troubled, very dark portrait of his father that the surviving documents and contemporaneous witnesses simply do not bear out. And of course, he stops his story in youth, dedicating about 3 paragraphs to his undergraduate years, leaving out his return to Cairo for a year, his grad school years, and, well, the rest of his life. So there are a lot of differences. There was inevitably a psychological dimension to all of this. Apart from being in intensive psychoanalysis throughout his adult life, his emulation of the writing of Conrad early in his career was a way for Edward to figure out who he was. Actively involved, in his words, in the laboratory of Conrad's mind, constantly probing the intellectual and spiritual designs of his life work. His enthusiasm for Conrad, as for others, though, was complicated. It was sometimes laced with dissatisfaction, in this case bordering on hostility. Just as he was drawn to intellectual personalities that he disliked, so too psychoanalysis gripped him as an unfulfilled promise. He wrote at one point what he called a psychographic history of the Middle East, complaining about the crippling effects of the Arab intellectuals' banishing of psychology from political assessment. Its psychological sensitivities had given Western discourse an advantage over the Arab Islamic, which had disastrously abdicated in the face of this decisive dimension of history and experience, in his view. Said's actual investments in Freud's work, though, were mixed and contradictory, and generally tended to deploy authors rather than subscribe to them without reservation. He was eclectic and resisted what he called a dynastic relationship to one's gurus, which is to say an uncritical carrying of their flag, as it were. And this attitude sets the stage for the contradictions, inversions, and reconsiderations that characterize his use of others' writings and thoughts. Psychology would naturally take us to the family romance and his famous relationship to his mother, There's no question there's an unusual intimacy there in both directions, so much so that he's farmed off to the United States for middle school, in part because his father thinks her smothering emotional embrace is retarding his development. But it would be wrong to focus only on his mother, Hilda. His relationship to women throughout his life was formed, I think, by being the only son, the oldest sibling in a family of 4 sisters, and being surrounded by role models who were almost all women, especially his Aunt Melia and his Aunt Nabia. The first, a very well-known Martinet who ran a school for girls in Cairo and is singularly responsible for his self-imposed intellectual discipline. The other, as I said earlier, a volunteer organizer, heavily involved in recording the atrocities committed against Palestinians after 1948. But given our focus today on literature, we also need to reckon with the fact that Said's relationship to psychology was inseparable from his relationship to language, and that the two were always tightly intertwined for him. As he put it in the overlooked essay, The Second and a Half World, the failure of the Arabs to mount a revolution is akin to their failure to reinvent language rather than taking it as a fact. He lays their frustrations at the feet of what he calls the social and psychological facts of language. If Edwards' effectiveness as a political spokesperson ultimately relied on his ability to write and to speak, we should note how he came to master the craft of both. Anyone looking into his life is struck by the sheer number of people and organizations that on a daily basis wanted a piece of him: UN agencies, Japanese newspapers, etc. So one is forced to think about what it must have been like to live this life of counterpoint, keeping all the melodies simultaneously in play, leaving little time for reading or writing, and therefore having to write a little bit like Mozart composed, fluidly and without revision, holding classes on Jane Austen in the morning, and then an hour later, writing a polemical response to the distortions and inaccuracies of Judith Miller before heading off to the downtown studios of CBS to participate in a roundtable with Jeane Kirkpatrick. An important aspect of his career in this respect was his love of proximity to power, networking, and he was prodigiously good at fundraising. Founding Arab study centers, founding Arab study centers in the Middle East, just as importantly, and being the public face, American study centers in the Middle East, just as importantly, and being the public face of the the Association of Arab American University Graduates, the AAUG. But we're again reminded of his partaking of the world of spirit, not a dreamer, but that doesn't mean that politics for him was not based on what is desirable rather than possible, and that the latter is the compass for what is possible. But none of this is to say that writing was effortless for him exactly. It is rather that he was always writing in his head, even as he was having a conversation with you. The essays and books pour out when they can no longer be contained. I've been asked from time to time what book or essay of his I would choose if stranded on a desert island, that kind of question. My first impulse would be to say that it would be one of his essays, because essays by their nature are fragmentary, unfinished, an attempt rather than a conclusive synthesis. He confided in friends that he thought he was much better at assembling fiches, right, index cards, than at writing a coherent book, beginning to end. And every one of the major books for which he is known are in some ways ungainly, with at least one runaway chapter, so that one has the feeling he was only very painfully given over to the layered ideas to create the veneer of the overall coherence of the book. But if I had to make such a choice, I would choose one of his interviews, because his major art was conversation. That's where Edward shone. And if he had written every word he did, but had not been a public speaker or frequent interviewee, if tens of thousands of his readers had never seen him perform on the lecture circuit, or as a subject of a documentary film, or in the one-on-one television interviews that he often did, he would not have been as effective, and we would not know him in the same way. The volumes of essays he published, especially his essays for the Arab audience, collected from Arab newspapers, never settled for a single statement, but a variety of often unlike observations in different genres, at times admiring, entertaining, angry, or difficult. The older he got, the more simply he wrote. When he wanted to, Edward responded to hostile critics by tearing their heart out with a rejoinder. His more usual mode, though, was mollifying indirection. another thing that he learned by studying literature. He was frequently tactful to the point of evasion. This was a form of negotiation, certainly. I'm not sure there is anything exilic or post-colonial about it. He was, as I point out, rather a secret agent, to borrow an image from one of Conrad's novels, a man whose actual views on American anti-intellectualism, the pompous aestheticism of new critical orthodoxies, the imperial swagger of American liberalism, the lobotomized cheerleading of American popular culture, and so on. These are all views that he held from the 1950s onwards. These are ones that he felt very acutely that he could not simply blurt out. It was explosive stuff, and he had to find a way to be heard. This required maneuvering, speaking in code, a strategy of deflection, and so on. On the other hand, if you take a late essay like On Defiance and Taking a Position, you will see that Edward found limits to negotiation, and he often expressed this in his own practice. His conduct over the Oslo Accords, as many of you will recall, involved his comparing the PLO leadership to Buthelezi, that is, one who presides over a Bantustan, by collaborating with the occupying power. That is letting it all hang out. But the flip side of this strategy of deflection was, as I said, an ingenuous, plain, honest declaration of intent, a sticking his neck out to state without equivocation a commitment to justice in a deliberately unironic, exposed sort of way. Edward was a much more politically radical thinker than he at times appears to be, given his calculated public restraint. He was very conscious about studying the ways in which texts and ideas attain mass density and referential power. This is what his apprenticeship among the Orientalists taught him. And he took his cues from figures in the past who managed to win a global following, in part by a studied evasion, the creation of vague coinages, ambiguous phrasing, when necessary to keep their audience listening and off balance. I did not mean to say that he was insincere. It was a matter of tact or of strategic withdrawal, although some of his antagonists might find this to be at times opportunistic. All of this is to say that he managed to publicly call Zionism an exclusionary colonialist enterprise, because he also added that we must all acknowledge Jewish suffering, the realities of anti-Semitism, and the targeting of Jews during certain periods of European history. So an example of the other side, this plain, ingenuous declaration, most famously took place at a forum with the Israeli journalist Ari Shavet, who was trying to tell the audience that Palestinians should stop complaining and just get over it. The past is the past, and there's nothing to be done. Said entered at this point and, with intentional provocation, countered with what is later to become a rather famous, notorious statement of his: "I'm the last Jewish intellectual. You don't know anyone else. All your other Jewish intellectuals are now suburban squires. I'm the last one, the only true follower of Adorno." What was he really saying? I think Edward took stock of the fellow and meant to say, look at you. Look at your betrayal, not only of Palestinian rights, but of Jewish memory itself, whose watchword has always been never again, which means never forget. You're corrupt. You know you have already lost the moral high ground, and you certainly don't represent any longer anything like what has made Jews historically clarions of the oppressed. Figures like Spinoza, Marx, Trotsky, Isaac Deutscher, Noam Chomsky, Adorno, and others, whose radicalism was directly related to their outsider status, but whose political effects stemmed in part from universalizing their condition, for speaking precisely not as Jews, keeping everything within the tribe, as it were, but as human beings on behalf of all. Edward saw himself in the secular tradition of Jewish thought, as Adorno did, and that, I think, is what he meant. His apprenticeship in literature was always present. He takes a word like elision, for example, which had been used in literary critical circles to mean finding what is beneath the layers of the text that needs to be brought out, the very thing that the text seems to be about. It's not, and this kind of thing. And he turned it around. He would say that it's much more likely to suggest for him something very different: the erasure of sensitive political issues in the US media, or the making invisible of an entire people, as it had happened to Palestinians, but not only Palestinians. At any rate, a rhetorical issue arises here in that Edward's constant rallying of lit crits to assume their role as public intellectuals by turning outwards towards society rather than inwards towards their professional guilds could not be something that could be accomplished with a mere verbal splice by using elision in some pseudo political way. A vital example of what he learned rhetorically from the study of literature had to do with his uses of genres, his mixing it up, as I said before. So let me end here with a summary. To be dangerous, politically speaking, means first of all to change the story, to make it impossible to utter the prejudices that before were common parlance, because the whole public mood has changed. To bring large numbers of people over to your way of thinking. Edward managed to do this, first of all, by being himself, performatively, an intellectual in the world, whose charm and grace and erudition were attractive in and of themselves. But he did it also by translating difficult ideas into compelling simplicities and to bringing what was worth preserving from the past into the present in the face of postmodern scorn. He did this with a deliberately earnest and old-fashioned discourse. So what in sum was his message? What did he manage to get across? The right to tell one's own story, the utopian place that is the university, a place to be critical, a place that should never be simply useful to society in any obvious political or economic sense, but instead to focus on what the world isn't and what it might yet become. The poverty of thinking that justice is complete when you hold on to a scrap of territory and call it your own, and the ethical and political leadership provided uniquely by the humanist intellectual. But Said was successful, despite his investments in difficult ideas, in leaving people with clear impressions that ideas have a material force, that fantasy projections of the racial other help mobilize conquest, that we should distrust all governing systems because they lead to the death of criticism, and that our political destinies rely on embracing humanism, which is the only outlook that emphasizes human choice and the critical spirit, that is, the right to say no. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brennan, for this wonderful presentation. You've given us so much information about Edward Said and his literature, his political career, and everything in such a limited time. The floor is now open for questions, but I would like to start with one comment before, opening the floor for questions. I read a review of the Places of Mind under the title, The Lost Worlds of Edward Said, by somebody called Greenberg. What he says, I'm quoting, amid the waning of the humanities, Said turned out to be one of the last literary scholars with a public presence. What he recognized and what Places of Mind sometimes misses was the tragedy of his career. How by his life's end, the causes for which he fought were ultimately defeated. I have to repeat this. So how by his life's end, the causes for which he fought were ultimately defeated. The Palestinian Liberation Movement, whose cause animated so much of Said's writing, was headed toward ruin, a reality he was among the very few to realize. And the humanities, whose flourishing made his career possible, were entering downward spiral from which they show no sign of recovery. Now, this quote, I have two questions about them. The first one is general. As a scholar of the humanities living in the US and open to the world as a whole, do you really think we are witnessing a waning of the humanities, and why? This is question number one. Question number two is, do you really think the causes for which he fought were ultimately defeated, mainly, I mean, the Palestinian Liberation Movement, and his dedication and defense of the Arab Islamic world in general. These are my two questions. Do you want me to the first one?
Big questions, yeah. No, thank you for those. That's really good. You know, it's a little bit like Samuel Beckett saying, "I can't go on, I must go on." I think, you know, Edward popularly wrote a very popular essay called, you know, "On Lost Causes." So I think he was aware of the difficulties that he faced, and he was also very aware of the complicity within the humanities on the one hand, right? The conduct of certain humanists being inward turning and involved in theories and so on, which made them ripe targets for the public sphere, and for the attack on the humanities to be more effectively enacted by state legislatures and by administrators who have singled out the humanities, I think, precisely because of what he showed they were capable of. I'm not saying that it was all due to Edward, that the attack on the humanities had everything to do with Edward Said alone as a person and as an influence. But I think that the kind of thing that Edward showed the humanities stood for, that this was this right to be critical, this thinking outside of accepted norms, this complete deflection and disinterest in kind of this pseudo specialization that allows pundits on the, you know, media, in the media, to assume a kind of authority that is undeserved. I mean, all of those sorts of things he really was effective at showing. And so I think that people understood the humanities to be dangerous. And this is one of the reasons, not only because of the scientistic assumptions of American culture that will, you know, basically look at the university as a training ground for business. That has happened, and there's lots of complex things that are also going on at the university. That this is what they're singling the humanities out for. I think the humanities are much more resilient than this particular reviewer seems to suggest. I think that they'll always be vibrant at the big name schools, the well-funded schools, the Ivy League and so on. It isn't, in fact, in a very, very critical situation, deeply under attack. I don't dispute that Edward saw. What I think, though, is there's two things I would point out that would counter the narrative of despair. One of them is in regard to the Palestinian issue, which is indeed at a very, very dark moment in its history. That in some ways, the reflexive response of most younger people in places like the United States and Britain, at least, is much more automatically critical of Zionism than it had ever been before this. So I think that there is an enormous opportunity for those involved in the Palestinian conflict to successfully mount the kind of movement that had been done in South Africa against apartheid, or had been done actually all around the world in regard to South African apartheid. To win that moral high ground seems to me to be much more likely, and the material conditions exist for it than has ever existed before. That's one thing. The other thing I would say is that what the neoliberalization of the university and the attack on the humanities has produced is a very, very large stratum of dangerous classes, if I could put it that way, to use the word danger again. That is, a number of people with an enormous amount of critical acumen and writerly abilities who can't hope to get a tenure-track job in the university. It seems to me that the humanities will, under these kinds of conditions, migrate to a number of online publications, a number of very, very well-written crossover journals that appear both in print and online, and that there'll be a public forum that way. So and that's in fact what I think is unfolding in a number of journals like N+1 and the Baffler and the Jacobin, and there's this creation of this whole stratum that is self-consciously embracing the spirit of the humanities, even if they're not being given tenure-track jobs in the university. So I think there's reason for hope too, and I think that if Edward were alive, he would stress the necessity to go on, regardless of the odds against it, and would probably latch onto the positive.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Brennan. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'm sure there are questions. Please. Yes, Professor Saad, please.
It's me, because I'm using his mobile, yeah. By the way. Okay. Yeah. We can't thank you enough, Professor Brennan, for this really masterful and compelling presentation on Edward Said. I really feel I've been enriched with a better understanding of what kind of person Said is. I have two questions. Reading your book, Places of Mind, I've been reading this for 4 weeks, and I came across this quotation saying that Said moved the humanities from the universities to the political map and to the center of public life. Could you possibly clarify this? Yeah. And this is one. And the second, how did he keep social and literary criticism alive for decades? Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so a couple things there. I think that the common, the truism, maybe the commonly accepted line that we are all taught to believe is that the university is an ivory tower, and that the people in the humanities produce people who can't get jobs because there's no actual set of talents or skills that can be translated into what is useful or employable. And therefore, there's something toothless about the academic humanities that consists of a number of people who spout obscure theories, and they're basically talking to themselves, right? I think this is the kind of thing that a lot of people say, especially journalists who don't have PhDs and are somewhat resentful. To me, this is utterly ignorant. I mean, if you look at the history of public discourse in the United States, if you look at American popular culture and so on from, let's say, the 1980s onward, it's very clear that there's a direct line of communication between what's being invented and articulated in seminar rooms in the university, and what is appearing in theater programs, and the curatorial writing in museums, and the scripts of Hollywood, like Matrix, for example, but there's many others. There's an enormous direct influence that came from the university humanities in the age of post-colonial studies that was definitely picked up on by people in the general sphere of the major mainstream media. And it was led by humanist intellectuals. So I think that, Edward was maybe one of the more prominent people to effect this transition, or to be the go-between between these spheres. But the fact of the matter is that he didn't single-handedly do this, but he helped launch a way of being a public intellectual that many university professors emulated and took in their own directions. And this had enormous public effects. It's just demonstrable. I mean, the book I wrote that was mentioned at the beginning, Muna, Wars of Position, The Politics of Left and Right, in its various chapters, in fact, documents and traces exactly how this connection between the university seminar room and the public culture took place. So that would be an answer to your first question. In terms of Edward's persona, his intellectual, profile, what made him keep literature and political criticism alive in the way that he did in the most, we can't stress this enough, the most unpropitious moment, right? I mean, this was the Reagan-Thatcher era, which he would frequently describe in just those terms. This was the time when one could no longer count on a left-leaning youth constituency like had been true in the 1970s as a result of the anti-Vietnam War movement. People had it's the me decades. People were discovering postmodernism. They're giving themselves over to kind of a mindless and cynical surrender, as it were, to American popular culture and corporate life. It couldn't have been a harder time to do what he did, but it's precisely because he carried from the past this image of what it meant to be a public intellectual of the sort that really kind of hadn't existed in the United States before. I mean, we have our Noam Chomskys and we have our Hannah Arendts, and there are these moments of, there are these individuals sort of buck the stream and show that it's possible to be an intellectual who's listened to, like exists, for example, in Europe. But for the most part, it doesn't exist. One of the ways that Edward did this is that he was always in New York, and he had friends on the faculty of Columbia University who were had ties, had connections with Partisan Review and the New York Times and the Nation magazine and these sorts of things. So from the very, very first days of being a professor, he was molding himself into this New York public intellectual who always had on his mind the need to speak to various constituencies. So he's in a large part seeing his role as translating the difficult ideas of literary theory and literary criticism into a mode that will appeal to people who read the New York Times. And so this training in New York and being a New York public intellectual, and the entree that he was given by his colleagues at Columbia who were editors of these magazines or had a similar entree, has everything to do with how he managed to turn to the public and succeed in winning them over. It's really quite amazing to read his correspondence in the archive and the way that he would write to these editors as a very, very young man. Just kind of in a cheeky way, sort of putting himself out there and selling them an idea that I'm going to write about phenomenology for the New York Times readers, and he did that. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's at least part of my answer.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Brennan. We have excuse me, Dr. Sana, 1 minute. Dr. Sana, 1 minute. Please mute your mics, please. Okay, Professor Inam, please go ahead.
Yes, yes, thank you, Dr. Miller. Thank you, Prof. Brennan, for this insightful, very interesting information about, and very, very great figure in our modern time. I should admit that I've been lured to, as I was talking to my friend Lemia, into a dazzling world of such a great scholar and thinker, Edward Said. So many has been, I found out, so many essays and books have been written about him as a thinker and as a public figure with groundbreaking achievements. And I've been actually lost in that so much literature written about. But I was after an answer, particularly an answer for the title of your webinar about the element of danger. So what I did is that I read a lot, and I will quote some, and I put down some conclusions, and I wish that I would hear from you whether you agree with my conclusion or not about the meaning of literature being dangerous. So it has been contended that Said did a lot of groundbreaking achievements, that he put the critical theory in the service of liberating human beings. And he did that by arguing that the intellectual must reach the public life and not be confined to the academic institutions. He actually, in some of them also, this is another quote, said that Places of Mind seeks to explain Said's unique ability to blend the intellectual predictions and public activism. And Said believes strongly in the ethical role of the intellectual in telling the truth to power at any cost, be it being ostracized or imprisoned or even death. And he, in one of the interviews with him, he did confess that he received death threats at a certain point. All right. So now, after his death, do you think that he really did or led a revolution in the educational system in Columbia University? Did he succeed in making more intellectuals than educators in the universities in general in the US? And thank you very much for listening.
I guess the short answer I would give you is yes, I think he did succeed in effecting, first of all, a demographic change in the kinds of students who came to the likes of Columbia, and certainly the people who are on its faculty. That he was instrumental, if not unique, but he was instrumental in creating a space, an institutional space for people from the former colonies who are non-white. And so there's that kind of change and difference. And as I say, he was actively involved in setting up institutes or encouraging those who were setting them up, right down to fundraising. But more than that, I think that there isn't anybody who was either a graduate student or professor at the time that he was in his prime who wasn't emboldened by the notion of what it was possible for them to be when they watched Edward perform in public or on TV. He made it very, very compelling and interesting to be a professor at the time. And we all saw a much larger range of possibilities there. So I think he did in fact inspire directly a whole second and third generation after him to follow in his footsteps, to use his game plan, as it were. And everyone was aware of that. So he effected, if that's a revolution, and I think you could call it that, then I think he did that. I also think that, negatively, if you look at this in terms of what's going on right now in the university, some of you might or might not know this, but I mean, there's post-humanist movements, and there's movements towards the anti-critical, right? Post-critical literary criticism that doesn't attempt to analyze meanings of texts and wants the kind of aesthetic experience of reading to wash over one. It's explicitly apolitical, and wants to separate itself from the notion of criticism, which is negating actual existence in the favor of the potential of what the world could become. That's criticism, saying no. And they're attacking this explicitly. And I think that when you see these kinds of movements, you have to see that there's a conservative counter-reaction to precisely what Edward, among others, but he was foremost, created as kind of the lingua franca and the status quo within the humanities, a kind of radicalization of the humanities in general, not only in the sense of their effect on the public, but what they assumed themselves to be within the structure of the institution. The last thing I would say is I don't think that we should give too much credence to this counterposition of the university as being, unto itself, and then there's the public over here. The university is a very public institution. It is, there's major corporate structures that are the training ground for people who go out into the professions. And what goes on within the university is constantly being written about, and as it should be, because it has an immense and direct effect on the course of society. So I think that being a certain way within the university is also a way of being a public intellectual. It doesn't have to mean that, in Edward's expanded sense of, being a regular on CNN Tonight. But in his case, it was both.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Adra, question, and Dr. Mesa, and another person, Dr. Ali. So we begin with Adra, please. I mean, these are the only questions we're going to allow because so much time has been gone to questions, but they are all great questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Brennan, for your patience. Okay, Adra, go ahead.
Hi, Doctor. Thank you. Hello, Dr. Brennan. How are you? We've met yesterday. I think you know me. I have two questions. The first one, I just want to hear your opinion about what, while Halak recently, his statement when he was speaking about liberalism, Western liberalism, that he said that not only Edward Said theories not only emphasized then the Western modernism and liberalism, it's also was part of rebuilding it by conclusion. And this is because he limited himself to literature and making the whole theory not dangerous, actually, and the opposite of what you are telling us today. And thank you for of course, all the information I heard today. It was so informative. And my second question is that while I was doing my PhD, and of course I was doing it on war literature, and I compared between the First World War poems and poets and the Iraqi-Iran war, I studied Kipling, and I discovered that Said's statements about some of the writers in his book Orientalism overshadowed those writers, and sometimes actually prevented them from being re-investigated in the Arab world properly. I mean, recently, or maybe from the 1980s until now. So do you think I was right in this feeling, or it was just a side effect?
Okay. Well, those are two really, really important questions. I hope I understood them. I think I did, but I'm going to answer what I think you were asking, okay? Or try to. That Edward was merely a political liberal, not a radical, and that his emphasis on literature was, in fact, somewhat dispiriting or ineffectual in regard to politics, because it's, after all, only literature. Well, there are enormous debates that go on right now within the left generally, which is very divided. I mean, even the far left, the Marxist left or the far left, they're very, very divided over these questions about whether political economy and sociology are the only kind of disciplinary venues within which an actual engaged politics can take place intellectually. And that all this talk about literature and so on is rather, I don't know, compensatory, or it's a detour of some sort, because it's, after all, only the world of the imagination. I'm a partisan of within this particular confrontation, and not surprisingly, I would dispute this notion of the ineffectuality of literary study. It seems to me one of the things that Edward believed, maybe to an extreme, is that ideas create materialities. That there's this tension between idea and act, but that mass movements that actually change governmental regimes or lead to changed policies, which of course affects people's material well-being, begin with the telling of a good story. They have to do with a certain version of the world that you've created, a kind of mythos, if you will, that captures people's imaginations and wins them to a particular mode of being, if you will. Okay. Now, you could call this idealistic, but I think that with the emphasis on materialities as being your eventual goal, I don't think it is. I think it's just an argument about how mass movements operate, right? So the Palestinian struggle is not going to be won militarily on the ground. It's not going to be won by trying to curry favor with some important potentate that has an army somewhere to fight on your side. It's going to be won by taking the moral high ground and showing people that Zionism is racism, and that what exists in Israel is apartheid, and that it should be shunned, and it should be a pariah, just like South Africa was during apartheid. That's how it's going to be done. So I think that the literary authority that he was operating with made this emphasis of his more forceful and gave it meat and weight. And it seems to me he was on exactly the right track. So, and the thing is about his liberal, he was politically liberal rather than radical in some respects. I think I make that point in the biography, but I also think it's important that during the period when all of the self-described cultural left of the university were talking about, effete, in my opinion, effete writers like Jacques Derrida, or impenetrable, maybe, even fraudulent writers like Jacques Lacan, he was telling people to read Marxists. He was saying, read Raymond Williams and read, Walter Benjamin and Theodore Adorno and more than anything, Gramsci. And he made those people canonical within the study of the university. So there's this radicalism of a sort within that too. The last thing I'll say about this point is that the literary humanistic angle is absolutely essential in another political respect, apart from what I've already said, and that is that this emphasis, especially his emphasis on philology, is an emphasis on the fact that texts actually have meanings which are discernible, and that these texts keep us in touch with what happened in the past, that this is not infinitely interpretable, that it's not up to individuals to decide what these texts mean by some force of will, that there's a responsibility to reading texts to discern their meaning. This might seem like a very simple-minded kind of point, but it's one that is very much in dispute in the general public and in left circles within the university. So this notion of learning from the past, of praising the continuity that we have with the past, of choosing your own traditions, and of textual meaning, is the very stuff out of which political movements are born, and absolutely crucial for not making the mistakes that were made in the past. So I just think I could go on forever, but this is a very, very important question, but there's decisive and very, very concrete ways in which to respond to this first I don't know, claim or accusation, whatever you want to call it, that you gave voice to. In regard to your second question about the displacement of the reading of, let's say, Arab literary figures or other figures from other parts of the non-Western world by the emphasis on English canonical authors, of course, Edward was caught a bit between these two things, although he tried to rectify his earlier exclusive emphasis on the English canon in culture and imperialism by openly seeking a kind of indigenous third world theory, one that was not dependent on European precursors. And I think he was caught a little bit in a contradiction as he did that. But my response here would be that I think that, and here it's not going to be so much from my soul that I utter this, it's more my understanding of what Edward's position was, that, this tendency today among those in the far left of the academy to create a fissure between the notion of indigenous and Black epistemologies on the one hand, and European ones on the other. It's a false dichotomy. The entire history of colonialism and imperialism will dictate that these discourses are, apart from particular emphasis, intertwined and interdependent. That a lot of what is accorded to us to be European is in fact a joint creation, right? There's that. There's the third world intellectuals and activists on European soil were helping to create these European ideas. That's one thing. The other thing is that so many of the most important Black liberation figures or indigenous liberation figures are without shame drawing on the liberationist ideas that one finds in the European tradition. Why shouldn't they? I mean, you know, it's been an unequal playing field for so long. Why wouldn't it be the case that there's a larger body of work that one can, in this point in history, draw on, some of which that's European? So I don't see it as an either or. It's not a dichotomy, you know. C.L.R. James, to take a figure, one of the great liberation figures of the 20th century, right? Writes about Lenin and the problem, and his most famous work on the Haitian Revolution, groundbreaking work, the Black Jacobins, is almost entirely modeled on Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. So I mean, why wouldn't this be the case? So I don't see it as a dichotomy. I guess that's all I'll say. I hope that answered your question somewhat.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Dr. Mesa, please go ahead.
Hello. Thank
Hello.
you, Dr. Brennan, for the great talk. I have a couple of questions. The first one is a quick one. Do you wish Said was, do you wish Said were here to read your biography? I'm sure this is a tricky question. What do you think he would have said about it? That's my first one. And then my second one is related to what is happening today in Europe, the war on the Ukraine. So I was wondering if you could briefly talk about Said's notion of conflict and peace, particularly in relation to his ideas on universality and the role of the scholar, which you have touched upon. But also, more importantly, in relation to the idea of the exile, the ideological exile, if you want, which he also identified with. I hope that I have just stated my question clearly for you. And thank you very much again for the great talk.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the counterfactual that you pose here is kind of interesting. Of course, it's hard to answer directly because I couldn't have written the book in the same way if he were still alive. If he were still alive, I would have been able to go to him and sit down with him and clarify certain issues from his point of view, and it would have inevitably have been somewhat different. But I will say that I don't think it would have been terribly different for a couple of reasons, and this is what I would say. I wrote, before I was asked to write, because I was asked to write this biography, I didn't propose it. People came to me and said that there's commercial interest in this subject in New York, and that they had heard that I was the person to write it. So somebody somewhere obviously must have either liked what I've been writing about Edward or saying in my public talks, or for whatever reason thought that after consultation with some of his other students or people that were close to him and his family, that I might be the right person to do this. Now, what I'm getting at is that I had at that point already written about 13 essays on Said, and about half of those were written when he was still alive. So, you know, I knew him well, but then again, Edward knew a lot of people well, but he never challenged me on what I had written. He never either praised me for it either. He never talked to me directly, but I think probably it would be hard for anyone to read what someone else has written about them, and particularly about their entire life, you know, and career. I can't imagine what that would be like to witness it. But I think that he knew that I had my own take, but that it wasn't necessarily the way he saw himself, but it was one that he did not think was contrary to his efforts and his outlook and career. So Yeah, I think that he, in a way, was represented well by those that I interviewed and tried to triangulate from. In other words, there were so many different versions of Edward that came out through these interviews and through the various documents in the archive. And my plan, I'm not sure I pulled it off, but I tried not to have a kind of thesis book on Said, but to try to see him as a composite of a number of people's interests and perspectives. So I hope that something very close to what Edward would have admitted was his life and himself came out through this composite, people who were very, very close to him throughout his life, forming a lot of the content of the book. In regard to the Ukraine crisis, I think that I can't speak for Edward, but my sense of him would be that were he alive today, he would take the following position. He would say that the territorial integrity of Ukraine as an independent state should be honored and recognized. And therefore, on those grounds, it was something to oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine on those grounds. However, I think that he would have adopted the Chomskyan position, or it's his position as well. It's not only Chomsky's, but the one that it is incumbent upon American intellectuals to concentrate primarily on the crimes and the hypocrisies of their own government, rather than to join willingly the chorus of the corporate media and the government media, which I think it's fair to call them in the way that they've handled this crisis, and simply parrot their points of views. I think he probably would have pointed out that this war was avoidable, that it was something that the United States tried very hard to bring about, that they want very much to take place, that Russia maybe took the bait by going in. I think that the United States' long-term interests are something that he would very much have thought about, and those long-term interests include pitting Russia against Eastern and Western Europe so that they fight among themselves in the same way that they're trying to get China to be antagonistic towards and involved in conflicts with South Korea and Japan and Taiwan, so that these great powers that are their rivals will fight each other. I think that's pretty much what is going on there, and that there's the hypocrisy of the United States, I think, which would be foremost in his mind. Even as he condemned the Russian invasion, he would point out that this is exactly the conduct of the United States in so many parts of the world. And moreover, it was an avoidable conflict, that the United States' insistence on making Ukraine a NATO, why is there a NATO anymore? He probably would ask, right? I would certainly ask that. There shouldn't be a NATO, and there certainly shouldn't be this tempting of Russia to involve itself militarily, because it's afraid of the nuclear weapons on its doorstep. Yeah, so I think that would be the kind of balanced and give and take way that he would have approached something like the Ukrainian question.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure he would have appreciated your book. I'm sure also you appreciate the trust that his family and his trust has, has offered you. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maysa. Our last question is from Ali. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mona, for letting me in. And thank you, Timothy, for this interesting seminar about very controversial and very interesting figures like Edward Said. Thank you, everyone who attended this seminar. I have a very brief questions. Actually, it is quite relevant to something I did in my PhD thesis. Actually, I still remember, if we go back a few centuries ago, that when Plato established his republic, he regarded poets and literary figures in general as dangerous, and he expelled them from his republic. But Plato, however, did give actually some exceptions to those even literary figures who could prove that they could contribute positively and constructively to life, to the making of life. That's to say, only those who could adhere to and reflect the truth are regarded as true citizens of his republic. Nowadays, actually, I am quoting from one of the most important contemporaries of Said's. T.S. Eliot said once that the purpose of literature is to turn blood into ink. This is very, very, actually, I can see from my perspective, this is something really relevant to our discussion today. My question is, and based on this, do you think that we could now place Said well within those wise guardians who were allowed into Plato's Republic as reformers and as wise men?
What an interesting question. That's really good. I mean, not only on its own esteem, but also because I mentioned at one point that Plato mattered to him as I wouldn't say propagandist, but as an agitator and as a didactic writer of a creative prose that passed itself off as rationalist philosophy, right? Plays, dramas, in effect, that were, yeah. So I mean, the notion, I think that Said was an artist who eschewed artistry, that he sacrificed his aesthetic sensibilities in order to give himself up to the delivering of a message that would have political effects. I think it's remarkable that somebody with his aesthetic sensibilities, which are highly refined and always were, and they show themselves particularly in his writing on music, which is the only part of his writing where he really allows that aesthete lying within him to express itself fully. When you look at the way that he discusses literature in many of his essays, but particularly in Culture and Imperialism, it's almost always about the content of the novel and what it shows about the historical moment and its political effects. It's very little about the formal properties of the text. And I think that this is a conscious choice on his part to eschew that. But in answer to your question, would he be thought a reliable member of Plato's Republic?
Yes.
I think not only because of his involvement in music, which of course is also outlawed by Plato from his Republic as untrustworthy, but because he is someone who endorsed literature and invested himself in it and found it to be, quite unlike Plato's distrust of figurative language, the place where most of the knowledge that is bandied about in the public sphere in political circles could be ripely illustrated. He had this constant repertoire of the work that he taught for a living from modern British literature that he would draw on all the time to analogize, right, the political events that were unfolding according to something that had already been diagnosed within the context of a novel. So this would put him, I think, on the wrong side of Plato's Republic. On the other hand, there's one element that would make him very attractive to the Plato that I understand from your reference, and that would be that Edward sought in almost all of the writers that he holds up as his major influences, so Ibn Khaldun or Vico, or Jonathan Swift. There's a through line of emphasis in all of his readings of these people, which have to do with plain speech, right? Writing that emulates speech, and plainness, that is the anti-aesthetic, the anti-figural, is something that he is very interested in as a literary strategy, but also as a political strategy. And this distrust of figurative language, right? This feeling that Plato had that the author is dangerous because the author makes you think that when they depict a situation that they are masters of that situation. That, you know, like that they can describe a chariot race and it makes you think that they know a lot about chariot racing. They don't. What they know about is to create the illusion of knowing about a chariot.
Yeah, imitators of imitations.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that, you know, that emphasis, from Edward's point of view, he's very, very worried about the doxa of the moment within literary theory. You know, the ideas of deconstruction, for example, that the language is sort of this echoing inner chamber of semantic overdetermination. There's no way to get at the meaning of language because it's constantly undermining itself. You know, this kind of notion. And I think that he has very little truck with that, and he wants to emphasize those traditions from the past that emphasize plain speaking. So I think in this respect, he sounds quite Platonic. I hope that got your message somewhat.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been more than illuminating, actually, for me. That question was actually going on in my mind, maybe ever since, for example, 3 or 4 years, because I was particularly interested in Edward Said and his Orientalistic approaches, and I thought, what would have Plato said about him if he were alive among us now? I thought, this is my own perspective, my own opinion. I think that Plato would have favored Edward Said in a sense that Said is turning literature into something socially and politically constructive. But what you have said is quite interesting and really filled in the gap that I was after. Thank you very much, Timothy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brennan. Thank you, Dr. Ali. Thank you very much for your interesting
question. Thank you, Dr. Mann.
We're supposed to end the session, but there is one person who really wants to ask one final question. Dr. Jabbar, please, if you are still there, you're most welcome. Dr. Jabbar.
Thank you, Professor Brennan. Thank you, Professor Muna. Nice to meet you here in this webinar.
Same.
And also thank you, my colleagues. Actually, I don't have a question. It is more of some sort of highlights. You've mentioned, Professor Brennan, that the role of the scholar or the writer is to make an espousal between action and idea, or how to make the idea to act. And I think here lies the stronghold of Edward Said. He tries actually to tackle a very crucial issue, the dialectic relationship between the East and West relationship. In addition to certain terminologies that actually has become almost a norm in post-colonial discourse, the idea of space, the idea of otherness, and we have to confess that up to this moment, the idea of East-West, unfortunately, is still highly problematic, and it is still highly controversial. Especially nowadays, we have seen so many complications in the relationship between the East and the West. And you can hardly find any post-colonial theorist without referring to Edward Said. So I think one of the major issues that he has tackled and touched upon, that the East-West relationship, of course, he has exploited his skills in culture, politics, and he has made a very unified, well-informed amalgamation to utilize and shed light on this crucial issue, the relation between the East and the West, and also with other terminologies that we have seen with the post-colonial writers about what do we mean by space? How do we bridge the gap between cultures? Homi Bhabha, for example, Edward de Glisson, most of them have tackled this issue, which is still nowadays, we believe, that what kind of identities we are looking for. How do we bridge the gap and achieve a sort of human relationship between all all people around the universe. So I think it is here that lies the real contribution of Edward Said as an intellectual, that he has actually foreseen what will happen next. And we are suffering, unfortunately, nowadays, how much the relationship between people, especially in politics, has become so many complicated. And we have seen the recent issue in Ukraine. This is part of the cultural problem, part of the dialects of politics. And I think it is here that much more light should be actually shed on this point. Thanks again, Professor Brennan, and very happy to meet all those my colleagues here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for your comments. I want to endorse it. I think that's a very nice closing statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jabbar. Thank you, everybody. All your questions were wonderful. And all I want to say is that, you know, we can't thank you enough, Dr. Brennan. We really can't thank you enough for your time, for this great, wonderful presentation. I just have one little thing to say before we end this session, this great session. There's no doubt, of course, that Edward Said has left a lasting fingerprint on the world we live in, whether in the field of the humanities or in the field of politics, whatever. So I want to conclude with a quote from the preface to your book, Places of Minds. Quote, "No one in the 20th century, at any rate, made a better case that struggles over the meaning of secular texts, not just holy books, affect the destinies of rights and land," unquote. And this is really, really a great comment to kind of, you know, reflect on the influence, the great, you know, effect of Edward Said on everywhere in the world. In short, Said exposed how knowledge and art worked in the service of oppressive power. And I'm quoting again from, you know, a review that I have read somewhere. I remember this statement: "If Said's words still resonate today, it's because the evils he helped expose are as powerful as ever," unquote, which is true. Don't you agree with me?
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is kind of something that is relevant to what I was thinking of. Thank you, Dr. Mona, for this lovely addition.
Thank you all for your presence, for your time, and thank you, Professor Brennan. Grateful to you. I don't know what to say. It has been a great talk, a great presentation. The questions were great. Everything was wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the great questions. And,
looking forward to more of these lovely seminars.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.